Testaments of Honor project was a project that predated the book by a couple of years. Remembering my grandfather telling me stories about the First War, life in the trenches, and knowing that those stories had kind of disappeared, and talking to my dad and realizing he didn't know a lot of the stories, they'd skipped a generation, I thought it would be really interesting to talk to some of the guys who are still around and get their stories. So in the book, I think what people will find is a sense of the veteran talking about themselves, about what they saw. The thing that's frustrating for me is that of the 24 stories in the book, I mean, these aren't the best, these aren't the highlights, these are certainly wonderful stories. They just are kind of geographically and branch of service representative. But everyone has this fabulous story. But Dick, I mean, flying biplanes off of an aircraft carrier in 1940 and being in The Great Escape and all those things, I find astonishing, absolutely astonishing. They really are better than Hollywood scripts.
I think the Canadian Fighter Pilots Association gave my name to Blake, and he telephoned me one day and said, would I meet with him? So we did.
I think most people will find a lot of them are reluctant to talk about it for a variety of reasons. Number one, they don't want to think about it too much, because almost invariably there are some bad memories. As one fella said, he didn't want to talk about it. There's just too many bodies.
Well, I think when we finished, I think a lot of us just put behind our POW days and wartime days and decided we'd start life anew and start from there, which we did. And it was only really recently that I've gone back to telling stories about POW life or wartime life, that kind of thing. The kids diving into the water or something, you know, when they were small, and then we'd reverse the thing and you'd see them coming back out. And so maybe this program is going to be the same thing. Isn't that a beautiful chapel? I've been here 40 years and I lived in Victoria 40 years and I've never been to visit this. It's just beautiful. Memory of officers and seamen and Marines belonging to the Royal Navy, buried on Deadman's Island, Esquimalt. Final rest in faraway frontier. This tiny church in Colville Road was founded for the men of the Royal Navy. Isn't that wonderful? Well, I think as we're coming up to the 11th of November, I think that our kids are becoming more and more conscious of what the veterans have done and left for us.
Boys, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dick Bartlett to you. There is a rather funny connection. It's the same prisoner of war camp that Dick was in, as we just found out today. It was the exact same one that an uncle of mine was in. And so actually Dick knows my uncle better than I ever did because he was killed in the war. And that was a very interesting connection.
Notice you're all wearing poppies, which is nice. Okay, I was born in 1919 and raised in Saskatchewan in a little place called Fort Qu'Appelle. My dad was an Englishman who had come out in 1910 and still received the London Times. In the spring of 1938, I graduated from high school and noticed a little ad in the Times advertising for pilots for the Fleet Air Arm. I'd always had a hankering to go to the sea and I thought I'd like to be flying as well. So I sent in my application. In the summer of '38, I got the answer from England to come over for an interview, which I did and was accepted. There were about 30 of us training as pilots. We went down to Portsmouth for 3 months of naval training, and once we'd completed that, we started our flying training. When war was declared in September, life changed entirely. We started working 7 days a week, had airfield security guards, and the planes and hangars were camouflaged. I was transferred onto Swordfish torpedo bomber biplanes and took a torpedo attack course. I was sent as a fighter dive bomber pilot to 803 Squadron on the carrier Ark Royal, HMS Ark Royal, for operations off Norway in support of the British fleet and the expeditionary force. The Navy really wanted to have their own air arm, air branch. And they, in fact, didn't like it being called the Fleet Air Arm. They wanted it called the Air Branch, and very similar. The Canadian Navy had a very similar attitude, but it never died out. It was always called the Fleet Air Arm, and I think quite rightly, because there's a lot of history in the old Fleet Air Arm.
What made for a good pilot? What made a good pilot, do you think? Because you were flying bi-wing gladiators
Yes,
and such?
biplanes, yes. Yeah, I don't really know. It seems that Canadians have always been known, perhaps a bit of little individualism. When the Glorious headed for England, we stayed to bring the convoy back to England, but the Glorious headed off, and she on her own, and she ran into the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, and she was sunk within about 20 minutes. They had opened up their big guns and just sunk her, and I think there was only 17 survivors that they did pick up later. Well, we got back with a convoy to Britain, and then we got a message to go and find the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau that sunk the Glorious and attack them by air, dive bombing. Around midnight on the 13th of June 1940, 15 Skewer aircraft were sent in to dive bomb the Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. I remember the date and the time all too well, because I was one of them. The sun was just coming up as we approached land. We must have been a German fighter pilot's dream, because it was a beautiful, clear morning and you could see for miles. We were about 10 miles away when the flak opened up from the harbor. About the same time, two Me-109s attacked me from the rear. The anti-aircraft flak coming from the German ship had looked like an inverted solid cone of hot metal being thrust up in the air. On the first attack, the 109s knocked away pieces of my port wing, and then on the second attack, they put quite a few holes in my starboard wing. A shell from one of their cannons hit the fuel tank just behind my seat, but maybe because it was full, it didn't explode. Certainly an awfully close call. Suddenly, I felt like I had been kicked in the side by a mule. When I looked down, I could see 3 bullet holes in my flying suit. The fighters came in for about the third attack, but seemed to miss. I can't say for sure, because I started feeling woozy and my left side had gone numb. Blood was trickling down my leg and I thought I might pass out. I told my air gunner to bail out. But he'd taken off his parachute and said he didn't think he had time to get it back on. I knew he couldn't make it back to the Ark Royal, so I headed for land, attempting to maneuver around the fringes of the flak and tried to get a grip on myself. I put the old plane into a dive as it dropped my bomb, and it seemed pretty sluggish. I remember thinking, I don't think I'll be able to pull out of this. A few more pieces snapped off the aircraft as we drove. I didn't see where a bomb fell, but I know I missed the target. I reminded myself that I'd been juggling too much with the aircraft to get in a good attack. After much shuddering and shaking, the aircraft pulled up level over the water and they headed for the rooftops over Trondheim, thinking that they wouldn't shoot at us once we were over the town. But by the time I got there, the engine was shaking so badly that I could hardly read any of my instruments. Another surprise waiting for us here, though. The Germans had placed machine guns on the rooftops. So once again, we took quite a strafing as we flew over. A few miles out of town, we were still at treetop level, and the aircraft's engine seized up. The skewer seemed to stand on its tail, then just fell out of the sky. A great shuddering jerk and slammed into a clearing on the farmer's field. Both my air gunner and I made it out, but it's a dreadful feeling finding yourself wounded and on the ground in enemy territory. Just dreadful. I had trouble standing and my head felt woozy, so I had to sit down. After a brief discussion, my air gunner decided to head for Sweden, which was only 12 miles away, and it was a neutral country. But not much time seemed to pass before he came back with a German soldier holding a gun to his back. The next thing I remember was being in the hospital. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was very lucky. Only 3 out of the 15 aircraft from our attack made it back to the Ark Royal, and very few of us who'd been shot down turned up in prisoner war camps.
What was going through your mind when you got shot?
Well, it felt like a mule. I'd been kicked in the side by a mule, and a great big whump, and you sort of felt numb for a while. We carried little vials of morphine with us, and after we got out, the air gunner helped me out of the aircraft. He was undamaged, and I gave myself a great big shot of this morphine, and didn't remember anymore until I woke up in hospital. The Germans had taken me into hospital. I was taken out of the hospital and we were moved down into Oslo. The next day we were moved by boat over to Germany into interrogation camp, and then I was only there for a few days. We were moved up to a camp on the Baltic, Stettin. We had very little to do. We had no papers, nothing to do to read. You had very little to do. And our great thing was to escape. In fact, it was our duty to escape and try and get back.